Hey everyone, Em here. We're saying goodbye to 2021 and the podcast is taking a much needed break. But we aren't going to leave you hanging. As the year comes to a close, it's so important to reflect back on all that you have accomplished, learned, and overcome. Resolutions are great, but sticking to them is kind of hard, so Mo and I wanted to share some episodes that we think may help you as you enter 2022. Listen in as we discuss mental health with the pod's very first guest, Christa Lamont, licensed marriage and family therapist. Enjoy.
Hey, girl.
Hey, Monique. I'm really excited. Today we have a guest.
Hello.
Hi, this is Christa. She's a friend of mine from high school back in the days of Doc Martens and Alanis Morissette and all that crazy stuff, no doubt.
And Gento jeans.
Yeah, Jinko jeans, the 90s. Today we're going to be talking about mental health. And Christa, you know a little bit about that. Do you want to tell us a little about yourself?
Well, I know a little bit about mental health. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist here in the state of California, and I have my own therapy practice. Prior to that, I've been kind of all over the place. I worked for 7 years in a residential treatment facility for at-risk youth. And then I worked for 3 years for the Marine Corps as a civilian family readiness officer. So I was a special staff officer for a colonel for an aircraft group. We had about 4,500 Marines and sailors. So
Wow.
I was in charge of overseeing the program, making sure that the personal and family readiness needs were met. So I've just kind of been all over the place, mostly working for nonprofits. So private practice, they told me it was going to be boring for me. That has not been the experience. Mostly, though, my passion is working for veterans. So I am a military widow. My late husband did 16 years in the Marine Corps before he died of leukemia. So that's something that's very important to me, working with veterans with PTSD. That's just like a legacy I kind of wanted to carry on. We always had a dream. He worked really hard to put me through grad school. so we carried that dream on, but it's very fulfilling work. I love being a therapist because I get to work with people from just all walks of life, and I think it creates a really different perspective. I think most people, when they're in their jobs, they're kind of in I don't want to say a caste, that sounds horrible, but like a little bit, right? They deal with who they, but when you work in mental health, you really deal with everybody. And you get everybody's perspectives, which is wonderful for personal growth. It's also very emotionally overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah.
To watch what people are going through, and we've been going through it in this country, especially always, I think since our nation's inception, but especially this last year has just been.
Yeah.
I can't believe you work for the Marines, because we were just talking about this, was it last week or the week before? And I said, I guess I misspoke. I said, there is no mental health, because it seems like there's no mental health support in the military. And I guess that I was wrong when I said that.
Well, so my job in particular was not a clinical job. So I was more almost like a social worker. So I was more resource and referral. I wasn't providing direct clinical services. I would refer to the counselors on the base. However, I wouldn't say that.
But they had counselors.
Yeah, you're wrong though. The counseling resources are still very limited for our active duty military. My little brother is actually in the Navy right now. He's a corpsman, and he was telling me they get 12 sessions a year for active duty. And I was like, wait, what?
That's insane.
But they're trying. We're at least at a point where we can have a dialogue about mental health. I have a dear friend of mine. She used to do what I did in the Marine Corps, and then she went to USC. She got her doctorate. She's a psychologist now, and she's an embedded mental health specialist. So the Marine Corps is trying to do that. So they do have embedded mental health specialists now at some of the units, and they kind of keep a pulse on what's going on with mental health needs. They do provide direct clinical services. So they're getting there.
Well, I think that kind of ties into or leads into one of the questions we really wanted to ask. You're talking about PTSD. Like, when should a person seek therapy? Is it something that they should just do as like regular maintenance or upkeep? Or is there a certain, like, if you're feeling a certain way, like, how do you know when you should go talk to somebody?
It's kind of hard. Definitely if you're feeling a certain sort of way, right? So,
right.
Okay. So in our field, right, we have what we call the DSM. You've probably heard of it, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, right? And that's how we diagnose people. Well, everything in the DSM, if I opened it right now and I started reading any given diagnosis, you might say, "Ooh, I have that," because you have like,
Yep.
Right. I got that WebMD issue. I do
Yeah.
that a lot.
So, but one of the things in the DSM is it says if it's causing dysfunction in your life. So anytime you're having a certain level of dysfunction in your life, probably not a bad idea to seek help, right? So it could be the smallest thing. It could be, just I'm bouncing from job to job. I can't seem to find myself. It could be, me and my spouse are arguing a lot and I don't know what the root is of the argument. Anytime you have a major life change, I had a couple come to me a while back and I almost fell out of my chair because usually when I get couples in here, they hate each other, right? So I had this uncle and they were newlyweds. They hadn't been married that long. They were still in love. They were like holding hands on my couch. My couch is 8 feet long in here. And I'm going to tell you right now, sometimes like 8 feet's not far enough for some of these couples that come really sad.
Oh my God.
But they were like sitting next to each other, all cute. And I'm just like, I don't know what to do with this. But they were saying that was recently diagnosed with cancer. And so they knew it was going to be stressful. So they came to therapy proactively ahead of time.
I love it. Relationship goals.
And it did come out. There was some stuff like from her childhood and stuff. So, I mean, there's always things, right? I think that if people can get into therapy quick at the first sign of something, that's fine, and there are times where I will have clients come to me kind of early on proactively, and they'll say, okay, and they think they're done after like 3 or 4 sessions, and I think they're done and they're fine, they're stable, they're ready to go, right? But then what will happen is something will happen 6 months down the road, or something major will pop up and they'll come back and they'll go, I thought I was done, but this came up and come on back. I always tell people, you always come back. There's no shame in coming back, right? But the value of that is the foundation has been laid, the relationship is there. And so when something does pop up, they don't feel weird coming to me with it. And I already have a little background and I'm already like a safe person, that they trust. Yeah. So that's kind of the benefit, even if you don't think, I have had a couple of clients, they're like, well, my wife says I should be here, but this, not, and the other, and talk to the wife. There's not major issues, but they'll say things like, well, I'm kind of seeing little things or whatever. So they'll come in proactively and they'll say, well, I feel like I'm wasting your time. You're never wasting a therapist's time unless you're just not working. I mean, if you want to come in and just like not work at all, then, please, by all means, save that hour for somebody else. But generally speaking, you're never wasting a therapist's time if you come in. And, a lot of times people these days don't know how to have relationships. And I don't mean like
guilty. Monique, she's talking about your stuff that you like to talk about.
F off.
The amount of adults I get who don't know how to form friendships, right? It's like, I don't know exactly where the awkward stage is in life, but there comes an awkward stage. Like you guys met, I think sometime, when you were in college-ish or?
No, we met at work.
Yeah, we met, we're 24, 25. No, but that's what I was saying, Monique, not about like romantic relationships. I was just saying, this is what you like to talk about. Why can't we relate to each other in an appropriate way?
I'm good with friendships. I like that. I feel like I've mastered friendships, the relationships.
Hey.
That's another thing. And it's so funny. When I was seeking therapy like 20 years ago, the therapist said, because I have ADHD, and the therapist said, I don't think you really need to worry about your ADHD. You're working, you seem to be stable as far as life, but let's get to why you've never been in a relationship, as a grown woman. And I ran. I was like, bye. I don't really have time for that. And so it took like several years to come back and get to the root of everything. It's just crazy, So how do you deal with that with people who are afraid to face what's inside because they're scared to have the truth come out?
That's always, and I'm kind of the wrong therapist if you're that kind of person, because I'm
Christa's tough.
I love it.
Probably since I was like in high school, I've always been like, I just say things, right? But
yes.
I had this mentor. I was renting office space. I rent my office space from, but Bev, she told me one time, she said, Christa, she said, anybody who comes in my office, it doesn't matter what they come for, I see them for the same reasons. They said, you got expectation here, and then reality comes along and slaps it in the face, right? And it is true. And I think that that's part of where we have a hard time in relationships is we have these expectations, and they're our expectations, right? They're based on our life, our experiences. When other people don't meet those expectations, and I don't mean to like meet them like if they don't live up to our standards, just when we find that they're different than we expected them to be, than we assumed them to be, it makes it hard. So, most people are not secure enough in themselves, which is a whole nother thing I'm gonna have to like put on the parking lot here.
We'll table that.
They're not secure enough in themselves to just let people be who they are. They need
Amen.
so much that it's hard. And codependency is at an all-time high. So I have taken Miss Bev's theory and applied it, because that's what you do with good mentors' words, right? You keep them, but I've added to it. She came into this field back at a time where people still had good boundaries.
What's a boundary?
That's what I'm always like, what are boundaries?
I see people for 2 days, boundaries and expectations, right? So to me, my perspective is the root of most people's dysfunction is boundaries and expectations, right? So Brene Brown, I'm sure maybe you guys have heard.
Vulnerability.
This vulnerability, right? She said she found in her research a direct correlation between healthy boundaries and compassion and empathy. The more people have healthy boundaries, the more compassion and empathy they're able to have, right? But the more people don't have healthy boundaries, the more burned out they get on people, the less compassion and empathy they have.
Yep. It's codependency, just in other words.
Right. And, that codependency, it plays out in a lot of different ways. Okay, so if I say codependent, what do you guys think of?
Well, lack of boundaries, seeking approval, people pleasing, lack of empathy,
lower self-esteem. I think of.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what if I told you codependency can also look at like being completely antisocial?
Yep. Avoiding or giving unsolicited advice, things like that.
Well, not even that, just like completely avoiding people altogether, like being like, I can't handle people. I don't like people. Not always, but a lot of times what I found is that's rooted in codependency, because they are so concerned about what other people think of them. They would rather not interact at all, and they become like hermits.
Oh my goodness.
Usually comes out of like codependency in childhood from having maybe narcissistic parents,
Ooh, that's a whole nother topic.
Right?
Dude.
We gotta have a series.
I know, right? Please come back every so often. Every month we'll have a chat with Christa.
I like that. CCC.
So right now, I know you guys like to talk about like racial issues and stuff. This term out there, white centering.
Ooh, what's that?
I know. We're like, teach us. We don't know.
I thought that was just existing.
And I was thinking about it, I'm like, that stems from codependency too, because when you have a situation where the like white centering occurs, right? Where somebody says something and they go, well, not me, I don't do that. Like, or they get very upset, they turn it back on them. They're no longer listening to the other person's experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, girl.
Well, it's codependency. It's please like
defensive,
mad at me, when it's like, maybe it has nothing to do with you. Maybe this person just needs to say like, this is how I'm feeling. This is my experience. I don't want to be in this place anymore. And you're not helping them if you say, well, I don't treat you like that. Or, well, it hurts feelings when you say all white people. Okay, but that's their feelings,
Yeah.
And you really kind of have to step out of a place of codependency in order to have those conversations with people. And that's hard to do. And I think that's why social media has created just this like,
girl.
Codependency is money. That's marketing money.
Yeah.
Yes.
We talk about this all the time. Social media is like the worst.
Social media, one of the things I tell people a lot, is a conversation I have really frequently. And when we were growing up, right? How did we learn about the world? First, we learned about the world in our house from our parents. Maybe if we went to a babysitter's house or we were watched by relatives, then we got their perspective. And then we went to maybe preschool, right? And then we got a little bit more perspective. And then we went to elementary school. School gets a little bigger. We have a little bit more perspective, but we're also getting more intellectual intelligence, right? And emotional intelligence time. And then we go to junior high. It's a bigger school. And now all of a sudden we don't have one teacher. We've got 6 teachers, right? And so our perspective slowly as it expands. These days, these kids, we hand them technology from the time they're 2, right? And their perspective is a world perspective, and they are taking it all in, and they don't have the emotional or intellectual maturity to handle it all. That front part of their brain is not fully formed.
I'm going to go throw all the tablets away now. I'm like, what am I doing to my babies?
I say this, my daughter's on my tablet right now, right? So that's creating issues, because now all of a sudden we have this whole generation of kids that are like coming into my office, and they're 12 years old, and they're like, I'm transgendered, I'm pansexual. And I'm like, I didn't know what those words were when I was young. And I am all for inclusion, and I'm all for having conversations, but who's having these conversations with these kids, and what is the level of knowledge?
Yes.
And why are we teaching kids about their sexual identity before we teach them who they are as a person? I'll say, well, what other value?
But see, for me, I don't know, for me, I feel like that's great, first of all, to be 12 years old in therapy. I definitely probably needed therapy at 12. I had identity issues as a teenager, as we all do, and gender identity issues as well. I wore men's clothing, put my hair back, and I just thought that was who I was. That's just who I thought I was. And so I don't know if I would have thought that I needed therapy at the time, but that was something that was just so stigmatized in my family.
I think, though, that there is a level of age appropriateness that we are omitting from parenting right now. I feel like I was very intentional about, when I had kids, I want to have open dialogue about sex, about sexuality, about a lot of things that were taboo when I was growing up. There were no discussions when I was growing up. It was a very Catholic, the answer is no. Anything sex related is no. That's just what it was. And I feel like there was a lot of information I could have used to help me make better decisions emotionally, sexually, whatever. I did a lot of research on age appropriate conversations to have about sex and gender. And I think that may not be happening. Like you said, Christa, with the tablets and stuff, they're exposed to a lot of things. And while exposure is good, without context or without conversation about it, they don't know how to process it. They don't understand what's going on. I don't know. We need to be age appropriate about things when we introduce things, how we introduce it, and make sure they're understanding what we're telling them.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's unfortunately the missing component. We are more overscheduled than ever these days. The conversations are not happening. Parents don't sit around the dinner table. They don't talk to their kids. Everybody's on their tablets when you do. Go out to, you can't go out to any restaurants right now.
Yeah. Oh, everybody's on their phone.
Right?
That's a big pet peeve of mine. If we're eating, come on. Put the phones away.
So it's hard, because when are those conversations happening? I grew up in a house, and my mom always talked to me about everything, whether I wanted her to or not. She was one of those people that was all up in my business. And I don't think
I love that, though.
Yeah, I'm jealous.
Yeah.
Now, I was an only child till I was 14. So I had all of her attention, even though she worked a lot, but I had all of her attention until my brother and sister came along. And then that kind of went away. And all of a sudden, that's when I went off the rails, right? I was super rebellious. But I think that's something that's important, and I can always tell, when people do bring their teenagers to therapy for me, the ones that fare best are the ones whose parents check in with me. A client that I took on last week, and her mom called me the next day and said, can we talk sometime today? And I said, absolutely. I've got a break whenever. And so, and she says, I'm just not sure how to navigate this. And she said, I know that what she talks to you about is got to be private, but if you could tell me how to have these conversations, I'd really appreciate it. And she asked me, do you have books I can read, whatever, and her
that's awesome.
Has decided that she's transgendered. And so she's like, I don't want to overreact. And she goes, but I also know that sometimes this is I think for parents these days, what's hard to figure out is this peer influence, because right now it is very trendy to be transgendered, or is it legit? Because if it's legit, you want to support your child. However, if it's a peer influence thing and it's a phase, you don't want to push them into something that's not actual. And again, there's no boundaries.
That's hard.
How do you figure that out?
Just questioning it. Don't you feel like, we've talked about cancel culture and stuff, but just as a parent, if you're saying, is this real? I feel like there's a certain level of guilt or pushback you would get. Why are you questioning whether this is a legitimate thing your child is feeling? Like, it is something that's more of a hot topic and like on trend now. I say that in quotes or whatever, because I'm not trying to be like minimize it. But I think that is a legitimate question. Like, is this really what you're feeling? Or did you hear this and you don't know how to process it and you think it applies to you? And I think just asking that question, a parent could get a lot of crap back for seeming like they're not accepting.
I feel like there's so many levels. As someone who had identity issues as a kid, I can't imagine, like, what if I did, go through with everything and then it would be too late. Like, once I realized, and this is my experience, obviously some people at that age do know, but I'm talking about myself. I looked into, I would look at all the Jerry Springer shows with like people getting surgeries and stuff. And I was like, oh, this is great. But then somehow, like, it wasn't even until my 30s really that I started embracing more of the feminine side of myself. I can't imagine, like, I'm glad that I didn't do anything, and that's just my personal experience. Yeah, so I can't imagine if I would have had no one question me and we just went along with it when I was 14 years old.
Well, and a lot of it goes back to just feeling comfortable in who you are. And, I see a lot of this stuff come out with kids that are middle school age. And I tell clients all the time, middle school is the most god-awful stage you will ever go through in your life. I tell them, if I had 100 adults in this room right now and said, what age would you want to go back to? Nobody's going to say middle school. No. It's horrible. You're not a little kid and you're not a cool teenager yet. And you're smart. You have ideas. You're starting to have a broader concept of the world. You're developing.
It's awkward. Yeah.
Although you're developing, that's where people start dating. It's all of a sudden, some of these girls have boyfriends, some of them don't. And you really are trying to figure out where your place is in the world. And so when you add to that things like gender identity, sexual identity, that's even a lot more to process. I was dating this guy for a while, and his teenage daughter's best friend is gay. His parents deny it. How? Like, how do you not recognize that this is who your child is? But they were in denial. They were very strong Christians in denial. But the guy I was dating at the time, he tells his daughter, he goes, well, has he had sex with a man? And she goes, no. And he goes, well, then he doesn't know he's gay yet. That's not.
Oh my goodness.
Oh my God.
I don't understand where he's coming from, because it's like, well, if you wouldn't go through the act, are you actually attracted to somebody? And maybe that's not something until you start being intimate with people. Maybe you don't actually know, what happens,
I still don't know.
You don't know, right? I have friends that are bisexual, and they're just attracted to people.
Energy. Yeah.
Maybe they'll be attracted to a woman, and it's just they're attracted to the person. I think a lot of that, though, is you have to have relationships with people, and you have to have healthy relationships with people before you can figure that out.
We talked about when we were kids how things were different, and just that idea being attracted to people. I feel like that, in my experience, wasn't a thing. There's a lot of things now that just are that weren't when I was a child, I feel like, or maybe I wasn't exposed to it. I mean, I did grow up in a very like sheltered Catholic like upbringing, but I mean, not so much actually. I mean, I had a transgender person that was close to my family. So I was exposed to things, but I feel like there's a lot of classifications, a lot of options. I don't want to call them options because I don't believe that your sexuality is an option, but there's a lot of paths you could go now that kids are aware of now that I didn't know existed, or maybe they weren't
right.
Really, they just didn't have a name.
Yeah, I mean, just it was just gay or not.
Right.
Or bi. There wasn't. And I was in the South. There was definitely bi, because I thought, I still don't know, but I thought I was, and I had a lot of friends who thought they were as well. And that was in the South.
One of the things that's important, going back to Mo, you were talking about your difficulties with relationships, right? One of the things is, as parents, we are so scared to let our kids be in relationships, and
that was not allowed.
Growing up, that we're not allowed to have a boyfriend or whatever.
Nope.
That did not stop them from doing it. It just meant their parents didn't know who they were. So, I think one of the things my parents did was my mom did let me have boyfriends. I wasn't allowed to like have them in my bedroom or something. There was limit. She knew who I was dating, and that makes a big difference. And what happens is, and I'm not knocking parents, they have their own reasons for doing this, right? But just throwing an idea out there based on what I've seen, right? If you don't allow your children to have relationships, if they have a crush on somebody and you don't let them talk to you about it because that's just wrong and you can't do that, how are they ever going to navigate those feelings, right? And then what happens is, They turn 18,
Never figured it out.
the real world, and all of a sudden the stakes are higher.
Yeah.
That is just a lot. It's a lot, right? And
You nailed it.
if somebody is dating somebody in high school, say, and the relationship is not healthy, the parents are still have a little bit of oversight. They can intervene and they can say, you know what, I'm concerned about this. Once they're off to college and they're living in the dorms, if that young woman, we'll just use a woman, for example, gets into an abusive relationship, who's got oversight to say something to her? I got into a really bad relationship shortly after my husband died. When you're dating somebody that's a narcissist, they cut you off from everybody, right? And so
Yep.
I was cut off, I mean, he had like alienated me from my family, everything, right?
Love bombs.
No.
If it wasn't for a coworker, thank God I worked with therapists, right? And she told me, I'm sorry, but you were fucking miserable. She goes, tell me one good thing about this relationship. And I was like,
Nothing.
couldn't. But if we don't learn to have those discussions, and the other part, since we're on mental health in general, right? There's a fear of failure, I think, in general with people these days. And I think that's another aspect to mental health and resilience, is reframing how we talk about how we define failure. There is nothing wrong with getting out of a relationship that is not working. We're afraid to fail. There's nothing wrong with leaving a job or a career that is not working for you, but we are afraid to fail. There's so much. And again, goes back to social media when everything is out there. It's like, you're afraid of the backlash. Like, oh, well, you broke up. Well, why'd you break up? Like, well, when everything's so public.
Everybody knows your business. Yeah, that is true. Oh,
one of the questions you had asked me via email is, what am I noticing with COVID?
Yes. COVID fatigue and just isolation, probably all of that type of stuff. Like is there a lot of new stuff coming at you?
There is, a lot of it is people now have time to sit with themselves, right? When we can't distract ourselves, distraction's a trauma response, right? So we can't distract ourselves with everything we normally distract ourselves with. And we all of a sudden have to sit with these emotions we've been avoiding or these situations we've been avoiding.
It's overwhelming.
Right. And then, in worst case scenarios, obviously, when you're trapped in a house with an abuser, that is also another problem that I didn't have, when COVID was not going on and people could talk to other people or they felt like they had an identity outside of the abusive relationship that they're in. So there's a lot. One thing I do see, though, like I keep seeing these articles like COVID is responsible for these teenage suicides and stuff. And I'm like, oh, no, it's just now we're paying attention. We're talking about it because the parents have to deal with kids' feelings. And all of a sudden, the teachers that were supporting these people are not there, and I do have a couple teachers that are clients and they're struggling, because they, one of them works in like an inner city and
it's hard to reach the students.
She is the check-in point for her kids and don't have technology and stuff. And so like she doesn't have the access to them. And she stresses and worries about them, and then I see these people going, well, teachers aren't doing anything, they don't care. They're just being lazy, this, that, and the other. I'm like,
I hate when people do that. They do so much. They do so much, like, and to be, I don't know. That's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah. But to be, criticized so openly and stuff, it's hard. And, one of the things that you have to remember, everybody's just doing the best they can. She says everybody's just doing the best that they can, even if they're doing quote unquote horribly, even if they're like really dysfunctional, that is the best that person's capable of that at that point, with the situation and skills given to them. And so going back to failure, when people say to me, like, I feel like I failed, I'm a horrible person, I'm not as far ahead as some people would be, I regret these decisions, I say, well, what other choices did you have at that time? You made that choice for a reason, right? So,
yeah,
with COVID, some of us are a lot of regret, and some of us are going to be like, that wasn't such a bad year, so.
Yeah, it was life-changing for me. Yeah, I'm one of the few people who had a positive outcome with COVID because, like we were talking about earlier, I didn't even know what boundaries were until like the past year. I didn't know that was even a thing. Developing healthy boundaries and developing a greater sense of self. And like you said, it was having that time. It was kind of like it was that time to myself to reflect. And there was nothing to do, and you get so uncomfortable. You try to find distractions and distract. but you can't get away from it because there's nothing to do. And so I'm one of the few people who like, I saw it as a positive, because now I used to, and Emily can tell you, where I would be so defensive, anything you say, what, Christa? Like if I would have gone into your office and you tried to call me out, I'd be, nope, bye, fired, but now it's like you said, I understand, like it's nothing personal, like nothing is personal. Try to understand where the other person is coming from. It's nothing to do with me. That's their reality. It's kind of like that. Your feelings are valid. Like I had to start saying, like, your feelings are valid. Cause I used to be like, no, what are you talking about? Like, no, your feelings are valid. It's just, it's crazy. It took all of this lifetime, but I'm glad I figured it out thanks to COVID.
Thanks to COVID. I feel like COVID's made me more stressed out. Well, I have 3 little kids and a husband who's now here 24/7. He used to be out of the house, and it gave us, it gave us a chance to miss each other, send little texts and be cute. But now it's like, we're up under each other all the time. So, that's a stressor, but just trying to keep things as normal and happy and healthy for the kids. And that has been my distraction. So I don't know that I've sat with myself and dealt with my own things. I think that's why, I was telling Mo, like I had some postpartum anxiety and depression after my last child. And so I had a few therapy sessions, and I was the person who said, okay, I think I'm fine. I gotta go, this isn't working for my schedule either, because who's watching my kids? So it's just like a lot of, but now I'm coming back into therapy to just kind of help manage the anxiety and the stress or whatever. But COVID, I think for families has become very difficult in managing work and, schooling from home, and just, I can't be the fun mom taking you to the zoo because the zoo's closed. Like there's nothing but us to keep each other entertained, which is probably a good thing, but it's just, it's been, that part has been hard for me.
And y'all do a talent show or something?
Oh girl, we've done fashion shows. You run out of ideas. Pinterest is only so far, with ideas for what to do with children. So
bring the zoo to the house.
We've done YouTube Zoo. I've tried. I give up. So here's a tablet. That's basically where we are right now.
And they love it, probably, I bet.
They're fine.
I challenged everybody at the end of 2020, because people have been in here complaining all year. And I'm like, okay, but I watched you grow. So you tell me, what did you get out of 2020? Like, name one thing that you learned about yourself, or name one thing that 2020 taught you, or that you gained from 2020, and I haven't had one client that wasn't able to do it. Even my most negative ones, they were all able to do it. So one of the things, see if you can see up there, but it says like mindset over everything.
Yeah.
Made it prominent for a reason. And it's over my whiteboard for a reason, because I use my whiteboard for everything. I'm being ADD, I am a hands-on learner, right? So
Same.
And I have found a lot of people really learn best when I break things down right for them. And therapy's got a lot of overlap with teaching. I taught for a while down at the community college when we were in Arizona, and really enjoyed it, but there is a lot of overlap between the two. So, knowing things, one of the things that I teach people, is I'm trained in dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT therapy, right? Which is
what's that?
Popular these days. Marshall Linehan developed it mostly for the treatment of people with borderline personality disorder. One of the things, one of the former beliefs in the psychology world was that borderline personality disorder was untreatable, which is not true. It is absolutely not true. Borderline personality.
What's borderline?
Okay. Break it down.
So, there are people, it's that push-pull dynamic, they push you away and then cry and say, why are you leaving me? They tend to have very emotional reactions. They tend to be people, there's a lot of like suicide attempts, self-injury, stuff like that with borderline personality disorder. So it can be scary to treat if you're not an experienced clinician, but it's not impossible to treat. And I actually, because I'm a trauma therapist, I work with a lot of clients who present with the symptoms of borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder, the people that have that, they operate out of a fear of abandonment. So once you understand that, and you can be forward with somebody about that and just address it head on, it sounds like, Mo, you've had some really good therapists that have just said, this is what's going on. Once you can address it, then it's actually extremely treatable, and you watch people blossom. It's the coolest thing. And it's not a short-term therapy. I mean, you're talking probably, I've got people I've been working with for like 3 years, right? So longer process. There's a lot to unpack there. But one of the things that Marsha Linehan came up with was the behavior chain. And I don't know if you've ever said or heard somebody say they did it for no reason, right? Or maybe mm-hmm. Nobody does things for no reason. Okay. So exactly. Every behavior serves a purpose, meets a need. So one of the first things I do with clients, regardless of who they are, when they come into my office, or with couples, is I will do a behavior chain on my whiteboard. And so that they understand where they're operating from. I understand where they're operating from. And so what you do is you address first columns, vulnerabilities, next is triggers, and then you have behaviors and consequences of those behaviors, right? So vulnerabilities are things that we carry around with us every day. And I've got mine, Em's got hers, Mo's got hers. When we get into the conversation, they all play with each other, sometimes nicely, sometimes not so nicely, right? So vulnerabilities are things like trauma, your postpartum anxiety and depression is a vulnerability right now. I always say, being a parent, I always list that because that is a vulnerability. I don't care if you think it is or not, it is a vulnerability. Underlying health conditions, so things like diabetes and stuff that are not managed. Some vulnerabilities are situational. I didn't eat breakfast this morning. That might be a vulnerability for somebody, right? If that
you're hangry.
Pop off. Yeah.
hungry.
Yep.
If I don't take my Adderall, that's a vulnerability for me for the day, because then I can't focus as well. And I don't have, as good at impulse control. So I might say things I don't mean to say or something, right? So those vulnerabilities, then those vulnerabilities, a lot of times they create triggers. So triggers are exactly what they sound like, right? So something that people not using their blinker on the freeway, right? So I work with a lot of veterans, so loud noises tend to be a trigger, right? So when you mix a vulnerability and a trigger, though, you have behavior. Racism.
Let's talk about it, girl.
Is a vulnerability, right? And so
black skin, too.
Right? So if somebody makes a joke, that can be a trigger for people of certain color, but it's not always a trigger for everybody, right? But because they don't have that vulnerability. So it's understanding those things. It's understanding, why does this trigger me? Where does that come from? And then when you can understand that, you start proactively working on that, right? So therapy is all about dealing with people's vulnerabilities and triggers, finding ways to proactively manage those vulnerabilities, identifying them. When you know these things about yourself and they're no longer landmines you're going to step on, it gives you a lot of power. And that's where that's where that codependency starts to lose its grip. That's where you start to be less codependent, because you understand your own vulnerabilities, you understand that they're yours. You understand where they came from. You have mastery over them to some level, and you can stop blaming other people, or you can stop expecting other people to fix things for you. You can say, you know what, I've got this, and that's when you reach that point, man, that's when people take off.
Yeah, it's so true. But the thing is, you have to get to a point where you are okay with that vulnerability to say, I have this trigger, or I have this vulnerability. And a lot of people are so, they like you use the word dysfunction. I know a lot of people who would hear that word, I'm not dysfunction. That means something is wrong with me. No way. And so how do you help people become more vulnerable in order to face and understand their vulnerabilities and triggers and grow from that?
I think the biggest part is normalizing it. A lot of times, I use a lot of I'm kind of a sarcastic person by nature. So people will say something and I will take it to the next level of absurdity. And I'll say, now say that out loud. And they're like, well, that sounds crazy. I'm like, because it is crazy. When you say that out loud, does it make sense to you? And they're like, well, not when I say it out loud, and that's the beauty of therapy. Sometimes just having people reflect your thoughts back to you, because when they come back to you out of someone else's mouth, you're like, well, wait a minute, maybe I need to question that. Where did that doesn't sound right? I think that is something that we just got to work on. And that's the key to that, is just getting to a point. The more you talk about something, the less power it has over you. To use my own, I'll pick on myself here, to use my own trauma, right? When my husband first died, I couldn't get those words out of my mouth at first. I remember I was at White House Black Market looking for a dress to wear to the funeral, and I was out of it. I was just really out of it. And this is the first time I said it out loud, I think, and the girl looked at me and she goes, "Are you okay, ma'am?" And I said, "My husband died." And she lost it. She started crying. And I said, I felt
Oh my
bad, but that
gosh.
like snapped me out of like the stupor that I was in. And I just started saying it more and more, and then you do kind of have to say it more and more as you're dealing with things, right? So as you have to close down your bank accounts, as you have to, whatever I had to deal with his car, that sort of stuff. When you start saying these things, the more you say it out loud, the less power it has. All of a sudden it's like, oh, I can do this. I can talk about this. I can put one foot in front of the other. And depending on what it is that you're holding on to, how long you've been holding on to it, the more you start talking about it, the less power it has over you. And that's really kind of the road to healing, right?
Exactly.
And so, when I'm dealing with people who have, say, I have a lot of like sexual trauma survivors, right? And when they move from victim to survivor, that's very powerful. When you can get to the point, and part of that though goes back to boundaries, right? Why do people not talk about things? They don't talk about things because somewhere along the way they did talk about it and they got a bad reaction.
Shame, guilt.
Yeah. So part of what I teach people though is if you're going to be vulnerable, if you're going to get to this point where you can talk about things, you got to make sure you're doing it with the safe people, identify people in your life that you can have these conversations with. Obviously, therapist, safe person, number one. Okay. My goal is never to have clients so dependent on me though, that they have to be in therapy forever. So, okay, how do we build on this? How do we, take this relationship that you have with me? How do we identify other safe people? A lot of times when people have been victimized, they are victimized multiple times, right? Because it kind of opens them up to accept it. And so helping them to recognize that pattern. I've run a couple of sexual trauma groups over the years, and that is one of the things that I focus on. And even just having other women in the group, it's kind of cool to see them meet up with each other outside of group or something. That's where the power comes, and being able to talk about it. That's important, or maybe even not talking about your own things. So I have a male client that experienced sexual trauma, and many years ago, I was the first person he told about it. And it's been probably 30 years since it happened to him, right? So 30 years of not talking about something starts to carry, it starts to build a lot of power in you. And that power is not pleasant power. It's ugly, right? And a lot of anger that goes along with that, a lot of rage. That's when you see people are just mad at the world, right? So, but he did this course that he wanted to do as a personal development course outside of therapy. And he brought it to me and I said, no, if it's what you want to do, go do it. And he did. And he was talking to females that were sexual trauma survivors. And he did not tell them that he had the same situation, but he would empower them and talk to them. And then he'd come back to me and he's like, I told this girl this, or I told this girl that. And I said, so that applies to her, but not you. And he goes, well, oh. And so then it led to a discussion where he was like, okay, so maybe that is true for me too. So just talking about it though, but I've noticed he almost looks like a different person. His face has changed. The way he carries himself has changed. He's lost weight, when you drop metaphorical weight of trauma, because trauma is heavy. When you drop that, you also lose physical weight. It's funny how that works.
A friend of mine told me that I put on weight when I was in a really bad relationship. And she's like, you're putting physical distance between yourself and this person by putting on weight. And as soon as I dropped him, I dropped a lot of weight.
Well, and I went to your Get Bodied episode the other day.
Oh,
I love these episodes. But one of the things that I was thinking when I was listening to it, when I have clients in here that have significant weight issues, there's almost always trauma somewhere in their past. And you really do, barring any health issues, because people do legitimately struggle with their weight because of health issues, their thyroid functions off or whatever. Barring that, there is a disconnect when you go through something. And one of the things that you do is you disconnect from your body. And so when you disconnect from your body, it becomes very easy to put on weight because you don't notice, right? You do not notice that 10 pounds, 20 pounds. It's not until you have to go up a pant size that you kind of start to notice it. But then you just
stretchy pants.
You just,
we're not even doing sizes anymore.
But see, that's part of I feel like that's part of why we need more mental health support in the Black community. Black women, including me, are overweight. It is manifesting in so many different ways with disease and with birth fatalities. And I think destigmatizing mental health support and getting Black women in therapy, because something that I believe is that the Black community in the United States is severely codependent. It's because of slavery. How else can you, there's no worth, there's no value set on yourself for all of these years. You had no value to society in society's eyes. So then you have to take the external. For instance, a lot of Black women will use education, for instance, to validate themselves and to make themselves feel worthy to society, or children, or men. So there's so many different things that are happening, but we're really not seeing mental health be destigmatized. It's always go to church. Mm-hmm. And that obviously is not working. And I think if we can get the mental health support in place and just start even with the children, that you'll start seeing that weight fall off, because it's like that mule of the earth. It's that metaphorical weight, but it's also that physical weight of trauma and the Black experience for women.
Yeah. A friend of mine had posted something a few weeks ago, and it said, it ran in my family until it ran into me.
I like that.
And
yeah,
breaking generational curses.
Yes.
And the other thing that I see a lot is a lot of my Black clients will say, well, it's just Tuesday, Christa, so I'm like, I've got, you call it bipolar disorder. I say it's just Tuesday. It's like, okay, there's a lot of things that are running through, and I'm off social media now for Lent. But one of the last things from this ADHD page that I follow, it said something about people are not getting help because it's normalized in the family, because it's like, well, I dealt with that, so it's probably fine, like the ADHD, right? I mean, that does run in families, but if you see it in your kids and you're like, well, I just had to deal with it, so you just have to deal with it. It's like, no, I don't just have to deal with it. But when things are so normalized in a community, then it just doesn't get the attention that it deserves. And, then you don't have the parents that want to reach out. And one of the things when I was working in the school-based counseling, I literally had a mom tell me, would you stop talking to my kid about going to college? They're just going to go to prison like their daddy.
Oh my goodness.
This kid was so smart, but he had a very obvious learning disability. And I was trying to get mom to show up to an IEP meeting so that we could get this kid some services, because without her signature, we couldn't get anything, and it's like, your kid doesn't have to go to prison. Your kid can go to college. Your kid can do a lot of things. He's really smart, really creative. Artistic abilities were so good, and he was so sweet. On one of your episodes, you guys had talked about, like, does it matter if a Black person goes to a Black therapist, right? And I could make a case either way. For me to be a white woman going into an inner city, a lot of times I was received with a lot of hostility or even fear. There's one apartment complex I'd go to and they'd see me and go running, right? They go like, hi.
Oh boy.
Kids or something, and I'm like, I'm just here to do therapy with this little boy. So it's hard to hear from somebody like me. But also, I think it's hard to hear from a Black therapist too, because they're like, oh, what, you forgot where you came from and you think you're better than me just because you went off to college, So I don't know. I mean, when people are that defensive, I don't know that
it matters
one way or another. What I will say, one benefit of seeing somebody that's maybe from a different culture is they can point things out that are just Tuesday in your culture, right? That's not necessarily the case. The other thing is there is a value too to somebody who you can identify with. And so, a lot of my veterans like me over other therapists because I've actually lived the military life. I was married to a Marine. I did have to do the deployments, and I also worked for the Marine Corps. So I understand both sides of that. So I can speak the lingo and I understand the subtle dynamics that other people don't understand. I had to move my wedding date twice, right? So there is a value to that. But the other side of that is, if you have somebody that's too close to you, there's a projection too. And sometimes
Projection,
project their things onto you. And you're sitting there going, no, that's not actually it. And they're like, yes, it is. And I'm just like, no, that's not.
Okay, I would fire that therapist if they said, yes, it is. That's
right.
Like, you need help. That's something that happens with therapists, is that you have to be careful, as someone who has been through a lot of therapists, is you have to be careful about picking one who is not taking advantage of you. For instance, if you're codependent, you might get a narcissist therapist who is not actually helping you, who is just perpetuating the state that you're in versus helping you grow. So it'll feel comfortable. And I feel like if it feels too comfortable, that might be your spike senses need to go off. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, it is true. And I had a girl tell me that her last therapist fired her because she refused to break up with her boyfriend. That's not my place to tell you. And I told her, I said, you know what? It's your life. I get people in here all the time that tell me, you're going to be so mad at me, Christa. I'm like, I'm not going to be mad at you. It's your life.
Exactly.
To live with. Are you mad at yourself? And let's talk about this. Why do you worry if I'm mad at you? Like,
Well, yeah, there you go. Codependency.
So let's talk about that instead. And so I always tell people, like, relapse and bad choices, they're part of humanity. Like, that is, well, you are going to make choices that you're kind of embarrassed to talk about. And that's why I'm here, because I could be like, oh, dang, that wasn't a great choice. Now what? Like, nope. I'm like, all right, so what'd you learn from it? I don't sit there and go, oh, it's okay. I'm like, dang, that was stupid. Okay, so what'd you learn? And then again, picking people back up instead of keeping them down. But you're absolutely right, Mo. Unfortunately, there are narcissists working in this field. I can spot them. They're usually the ones that tell people how to live their lives and try to enforce something on them. When I was running the groups, I would have other people's clients in there, and they would be like, well, tell me what to do. And I'm like, I'm not going to tell you what to do.
That's what I was seeking in a therapist as a codependent. Like, I wanted them to tell me how to live my life. And so that's how I'm like, it's so crazy. There's so many people making so much money like that. It's sad because you won't grow.
No. And what happens when I'm not around? And the problem with that is therapists get burned out. You know why we get burned out? We get burned out because we have poor boundaries and we take too much responsibility. And that is something that a former boss told me. And I was in that place for a while where, if my clients weren't getting better, or if they were making bad choices, or they were doing things, I was feeling responsible for it. And she was like, you're not responsible for their choices, Christa. Like, you need to cut that. And once I cut that, I loved my job so much more, because I realized they're going to go up, they're going to go down. I can't take the credit for it when they do go up, and I cannot take the credit for it when they tank. Like, that's, I have to look at myself and make sure I'm doing the best I can. Obviously I want
professional responsibility.
Right. Like, be like, whatever, I don't care. But at the same time, I want them to feel responsible. When they're like, oh my gosh, you did so much for me. I always tell them, you know what, it was easy to do because you worked really hard. And I really love being your therapist. And, I always put it back on, you're the one doing the work. I'm here for you. You're doing it.
I hate to be the party pooper, but it looks like our time has run out. I feel like we could talk forever though. So we may have you back soon. Good. Yes, this was fun. And I learned a lot. So thank you so much, Christa.
You're welcome.
For all these little gems.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. And we'll talk soon for sure.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.